The attic room was my cage, not quite of iron bars, but of dusty solitude and the suffocating scent of forgotten things, a fitting metaphor for my life, I often thought, as I meticulously folded the faded linens stacked high beside the narrow window that offered only a sliver of the sprawling city below, a city I knew only by the distant hum of its relentless activity. I was Elara, the shadow twin, the unremarkable echo of my sister, Seraphina, whose name always seemed to glide off the tongue like silk over polished marble, a name synonymous with beauty, grace, and the dazzling heights of social standing. Seraphina, the star, Elara, the dim, unseen satellite. My earliest memories were painted in Seraphina's vivid colors, the hushed awe of guests when she entered a room, the way sunlight seemed to linger longer on her golden hair, the intricate, perfect stitch of the gowns my mother would drape over her shoulders, gowns that never quite fit me, no matter how much the seams were let out. I was always the ill-fitting replacement, the backup plan, the sturdy, plain book placed behind the shimmering, leather-bound first edition. The arrangement, when it finally came, was not a proposal, but a decree, delivered in the hushed, tense atmosphere of the drawing room where the air felt too thick to breathe. Mother, her face a mask of strained necessity, gripped the armrests of her antique chair so tightly her knuckles were white, while father, a man whose authority was usually absolute but seemed strangely diminished in the face of this particular challenge, merely nodded curtly. "It is settled, Elara," Mother had stated, her voice possessing the brittle quality of old porcelain. "Seraphina cannot marry Mr. Rylan Vance." Rylan Vance. The name itself carried the weight of empires. He was the titan of industry, the architect of skylines, the man whose net worth was spoken of in hushed, almost reverent tones. But there was a complication, a dark asterisk beneath the brilliant name. Rylan Vance was blind. A tragic accident years prior had stolen his sight, leaving him commanding an empire entirely through intellect and sheer, terrifying will. "Why not?" I managed to whisper, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in the grand space. Mother spared me a look that could curdle milk. "Because, child, Seraphina has a prior commitment. A more advantageous one, shall we say, one that does not involve marrying into a situation where one's husband requires constant, delicate management." And that was how I learned my purpose. I was to be the replacement bride. Seraphina's engagement to Vance was necessary for the merger of our dwindling family assets with his immense fortune. When the blindness became an undeniable factor, a supposed blemish Seraphina could not endure, I was offered up. I was the vessel, the stand-in, the perfectly disposable insurance policy. "You will marry him, Elara," Father had concluded, avoiding my eyes. "You will maintain the facade. You will be Mrs. Vance. Your life is secured, your family name is saved. Do not disappoint us." There was no room for argument, no space for a dream I hadn't known I possessed. My compliance was expected, etched into the very fabric of my upbringing. I packed a small, threadbare suitcase, the few belongings I actually owned, mostly old sketchbooks and worn novels, and left the attic for the gilded cage that awaited me. The wedding itself was a sterile affair, a contractual exchange conducted with muted efficiency. I wore Seraphina's ivory gown. It had been altered clumsily, pulling tight across my shoulders in a way that made me constantly aware of my own inadequacy, and when I walked down the aisle, I felt less like a bride and more like a poorly executed forgery being presented for inspection. Rylan Vance stood at the altar, tall and impossibly imposing even without the use of his eyes. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 35, his features sculpted with a sharp, almost severe beauty, framed by hair the color of midnight that fell just so across a brow that often seemed perpetually furrowed in concentration. When he took my hand, his grip was firm, cool, and utterly impersonal. His touch sent a strange jolt through me, not of desire, but of recognition, the recognition of immense, contained power. He never saw the dress, the nervous tremor in my hands, or the utter lack of joy in my expression. He only registered the presence of the woman assigned to him. The Vance estate, Aethelred Hall, was less a house and more a fortress carved from black granite and cold ambition, perched atop the highest hill overlooking the city. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the echoing footsteps on marble floors and the rustle of expensive, heavy draperies. It was here that my new life as Mrs. Vance began, a life defined by the absence of light and the constant presence of my husband's formidable, unseeing gaze. The first few weeks were a careful choreography of avoidance and obligation. I learned the geography of the house through trial and error, memorizing the placement of furniture by the bruises I accumulated in the dark corners. Rylan's blindness was absolute, and while he navigated his study and the main living areas with a chilling certainty, he seemed to view my presence primarily as a logistical challenge to be managed. My role, as dictated by the discreet instructions left by Vance's estate manager, Mr. Thorne, a man whose severity made mother seem like a nervous schoolmistress, was simple: be present, be quiet, and anticipate. Rylan required nothing from me emotionally. He didn't need a companion. He had his empire to command through a complex network of voice commands and highly trained staff. He didn't need warmth. He had the efficient, regulated climate control of the mansion. He needed only functional support, and I, Elara, the substitute, was equipped only to be functional. The daily routine was a monotonous torture of unspoken tension. We would take dinner together in the cavernous dining room, the silver catching non-existent light. I learned quickly that silence was the safest medium. If I spoke without invitation, my voice, which I realized sounded embarrassingly high and hesitant compared to Seraphina's melodic contralto, drew immediate, sharp attention. Elara, he would say, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated in the vast space, always preceded by my name spoken as if it were an abstract concept he was struggling to define. The financial reports. Did Thorne present them this morning? Yes, Mr. Vance, I would reply, keeping my eyes fixed on the untouched portion of my plate. And your opinion? This was the trap. He didn't actually want my opinion. He wanted to see if I was paying attention, if I was competent enough to relay the data he couldn't see. They indicate a necessary reallocation of assets in the Southeast Asian infrastructure projects, sir. A projected dip of nearly 4% if the current acquisition strategy proceeds. He would pause, tilting his head slightly, as if calibrating my voice against some internal database of expected responses. Correct. Thorne's summary was accurate, then. See that you review the quarterly projections by Tuesday. Do not bother me with redundant information. If I made a misstep, if I placed a glass too close to the edge of the table, if my footsteps were too loud on the marble, if I dared to offer a genuine observation about the weather, the reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Control yourself, Elara, he once snapped, after I accidentally knocked over a small, antique porcelain vase, a piece I hadn't seen in the gloom. The sound shattered the quiet, and for a moment, I imagined his sight returning just to witness my clumsiness. Are you incapable of moving through a room without causing disruption? You are a liability, not a partner. Liability. That word stung more than any open insult. It confirmed my deepest fear. I was merely a poorly constructed bridge leading to an outcome he hadn't chosen. He rarely touched me, and when he did, it was to guide me, a hand clamping around my wrist to stop me from moving too far away during a meeting, or a brief, corrective pressure on my shoulder if I stood too crookedly next to him at a social function he insisted I attend as his wife. Those touches were always laced with a cold authority, devoid of tenderness. I felt seen only in the context of my failures to be invisible. I retreated further into myself. My only solace was the vast, unutilized library on the 3rd floor. It was a place Rylan rarely visited, as he preferred audio reports and digital archives. Here, surrounded by the scent of aged paper and leather binding, I found a brief, fragile sense of self. I didn't sketch much anymore, the light was too poor, and the fear of being discovered sketching made my hand tremble. Instead, I read, devouring philosophy and history, trying to arm my mind against the constant erosion of self-worth. My sister, Seraphina, made only one appearance during the first 6 months. It was a calculated visit, scheduled right after a major acquisition deal had been finalized. She floated into the drawing room, radiating the kind of effortless glamour I could never emulate. She looked at me, not with malice, but with a detached pity that was almost worse. "You look adequate, Elara," she purred, gliding over to Rylan, who was reviewing documents, his head slightly inclined toward her presence. Rylan straightened instantly. His demeanor shifted, the stiffness in his posture lessened, and the slight tension around his jaw eased. "Seraphina, Thorn mentioned you were coming. How is the renovation of the seaside villa progressing?" He spoke to her with a warmth, a recognition that sliced through me like ice. He couldn't see her, but he could recognize the cadence of her voice, the subtle inflection that bespoke breeding and familiarity. Seraphina touched his arm lightly, a genuine, lingering touch. "Beautifully, my dear. It will be ready by spring. I trust Elara is managing the household well. She always was so dutiful." "She is compliant," Rylan acknowledged, turning his head slightly towards where I stood against the far wall, attempting to fuse with the dark wood paneling. "She does not interfere." Seraphina smiled, wide, dazzling thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good. That's all that matters, isn't it? Stability." When she left, the silence she left behind felt heavier, filled with the ghost of the connection I could never forge with him. My quiet endurance, however, began to wear on Rylan in ways he couldn't articulate. He expected a wife, a presence that offered some form of domestic comfort, however minimal. He received a well-trained ghost. One evening, nearly a year into our marriage, I was reading in my sparsely decorated sitting room adjoining my bedroom. Rylan entered without knocking, a rare occurrence. He seemed agitated, his usual icy composure fractured by something unseen. "Elara, I need you to read something to me. Thorn is away at the site, and my voice recording system is malfunctioning." He tossed a sheaf of papers onto a nearby side table. They scattered slightly, the sound jarring in the quiet. I rose immediately. "Of course, Mr. Vance." I picked up the pages. They were technical specifications for a new drone surveillance system, dense, jargon-heavy, and utterly beyond my depth. I began to read, stumbling over acronyms and complex engineering terms. I tried to inject a neutral tone, but my nervousness made my voice waver. "No. Stop." His voice cracked like a whip. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I apologize, sir. The terminology is quite dense." "Dense? It's the future of our defense contracts." He strode toward the table, his hands outstretched, groping slightly until his fingers brushed the edge of the papers. "You read it like you're reading a recipe for tea. Where is the analysis? Where is the comprehension?" "Sir," I pleaded, gripping the pages tightly, "I am not an engineer. I simply cannot grasp the technical nuances required to interpret this accurately." He stood over me, radiating a controlled fury that made the air around him crackle. "You are Mrs. Vance. You are meant to support me. If you cannot even articulate the basic parameters of my business dealings, then what possible function do you serve here?" The question was the crux of my existence. I felt the familiar sting of inadequacy rise, but beneath it, something harder, something forged in the dusty silence of the attic, began to push back. "My function, Mr. Vance," I said, forcing the words out clearly, though my knees threatened to buckle, was defined by the needs of the contract, which required a quiet, compliant presence. "I have fulfilled that requirement flawlessly. I do not pretend to possess the intellect required to interpret proprietary defense schematics. That is what you pay Thorn to do. I am not a mind you hired, I am simply a placeholder you tolerate. The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't the usual, tense silence of expectation, it was the stunned quiet of a man confronted by an unexpected variable. He didn't shout. That would have been easier. Instead, he moved away, pacing 3 precise steps before turning back. You are growing a spine, Elara. Be careful. Spines are often broken in this house. Perhaps, I whispered, gathering the scattered papers. But sometimes, sir, they are simply necessary for standing upright. That night, something shifted. The boundaries, invisible though they were, became slightly less rigid. Rylan Vance, the man who ruled his world through precise control, seemed momentarily thrown off balance by the sheer, unexpected reality of my quiet resistance. He stopped demanding pointless readings. He still spoke to me with cold formality, but the insults directed at my competence ceased. He began, instead, to test my resilience in other, more subtle ways. He started leaving me alone in company. At gala dinners hosted in the mansion, events I dreaded, where society's gilded vultures circled, scrutinizing the blind CEO and his plain wife, he would introduce me once, a brief, dismissive gesture, and then often leave me to stand awkwardly while he engaged in intense conversation with his peers. I learned to navigate these social minefields by observing. I listened. I watched the body language of those around him. I memorized the subtle shift in the tone of his legal counsel when a negotiation was turning sour. I became an expert eavesdropper, absorbing the vast, complex world that pulsed just beyond his sight. I couldn't contribute, but I could understand. One particularly strained evening, a rival CEO, Silas Croft, a man known for his predatory tactics, cornered me while Rylan was occupied. Mrs. Vance, Croft drawled, his eyes lingering on me with an unsettling mix of curiosity and pity. You are a remarkably devoted wife. Supporting a man in such a state must be exhausting, the constant management. I offered a practiced, blank smile. Mr. Vance requires very little management, Mr. Croft. He is quite self-sufficient. Croft laughed, a dry, rustling sound. Self-sufficient? Oh, my dear, no one at his level is self-sufficient. They rely on proxy eyes. Tell me, when Rylan is closing a deal, you his silent partner, do you whisper the finer print to him? It was a direct accusation of manipulation, a slur against the Vance name. My blood ran cold, but the training from the drawing room kicked in. I leaned in slightly, ensuring my voice was perfectly modulated, calm, low, and utterly devoid of emotion. Mr. Vance relies on accurate data and the integrity of his associates. If you are implying that Mr. Vance's success is dependent on the deceit of his wife, I suggest you bring evidence to the next board meeting, Mr. Croft. Otherwise, perhaps you should focus on securing your own failing subsidiaries, rather than speculating on the nature of my marriage. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving Croft looking genuinely startled. When I returned to Rylan's side 15 minutes later, he was standing rigidly, listening to his chief financial officer. As I approached, he stopped the conversation abruptly. Elara, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. Where were you? Minding my own business, sir. And dealing with Mr. Croft. What did he say? I hesitated, then decided on honesty, stripped of unnecessary emotion. He implied that my presence here is either manipulative or entirely useless. Rylan was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then, he did something he had never done before. He subtly steered his body, turning slightly toward me, creating a barrier between me and the room. He is an arrogant fool, Rylan stated, his voice carrying just enough volume to silence the immediate vicinity. Do not waste your energy on such trash, Elara. Focus on maintaining decorum. Your ability to remain unruffled in the face of idiocy is, perhaps, the most valuable asset you possess right now. It wasn't praise. It was professional assessment. But it felt like a life raft in a churning sea. He recognized that I had defended his reputation, even if he couldn't see the threat materialize. Months blurred into a routine punctuated by these small, jarring acknowledgements. I began to spend more time near him, not out of obligation, but out of a strange, developing curiosity. I observed how his aides navigated his personal space, how his fingers tapped a specific rhythm on his desk when he was deep in thought, the almost imperceptible slump of his shoulders when a long day of negotiations finally ended. I started to anticipate needs based not on instruction, but on pattern recognition. I learned the exact temperature he preferred his evening tea, the precise angle the silk scarf needed to be tied around his neck on cool evenings, even before the thermometer registered the change. These weren't tasks, they were observations translated into action. One afternoon, Rylan was in his study, seemingly absorbed in a dictation. I stood just outside the door, reviewing the household accounts, a task I'd taken on because the estate manager was consistently overcharging for minor renovations. I heard Rylan speak, not to an assistant, but seemingly to the empty air. The pressure point is the Lisbon contract. It's fragile. I need the historical regulatory filings brought up, the ones from 09 to 11. And I need someone to review the language for ambiguities regarding sovereign immunity clauses. I walked in quietly, holding my ledger. Mr. Vance, the 09 to 11 filings are in the secure archive downstairs, cross-referenced by date code 7 Delta. I can retrieve them, but they are physically heavy. He stiffened. Elara? You are here. Yes, sir. Why are you offering to fetch them? Because I know where they are, and you don't have Thorn available, I replied simply. And frankly, sir, I am tired of seeing the maintenance budgets padded by your contractors. I am ensuring the integrity of this household's finances while I'm at it. He let out a sharp, involuntary sound that might have been a laugh, or perhaps a gasp of surprise. You are auditing the books now. Someone has to, I said, setting my ledger down. I'll retrieve the files. It will take 20 minutes. I left before he could object. Descending into the cavernous, climate-controlled archive felt like entering the belly of a sleeping beast. The sheer volume of paper representing Rylan Vance's empire was staggering. I located the heavy, leather-bound volumes, struggling slightly with their weight, and hauled them back upstairs. When I entered the study again, setting the dusty volumes down gently on his mahogany desk, I noticed he had shifted in his chair. He reached out, not groping, but with a cautious, measured certainty, until his fingertips brushed the rough leather of the oldest volume. You retrieved these, he stated, not asking. Yes, sir. And you brought them to me. Yes, Mr. Vance. Why? I took a steadying breath. This was the moment where I risked everything by offering truth. Because, sir, you rely on information. And right now, I am the closest source of tangible information you have access to. I may not see what you see, but I can navigate the things you cannot touch. He turned his face toward the sound of my voice, and for the first time, I felt seen, not as a placeholder, but as a functional extension of his will. Read the summary of the immunity clauses for the first volume, Elara. Slowly. I want to hear the exact wording. For the next hour, I read the dense legal text, but this time, I focused. I didn't try to interpret, I simply relayed the exact structure of the language. And Rylan listened. He interrupted, not with accusations of incompetence, but with precise demands. Repeat that last clause. pause before notwithstanding. When I finished, the study was silent again, but the silence felt different, charged, productive. "Thank you, Elara," he said, his voice subdued. He then spoke to his intercom. "Thorn, cancel your evening engagements. When you return, I need you to cross-reference the Lisbon contract, focusing specifically on sovereign jurisdiction, using the data Elara has just reviewed." He paused, and then, a small, almost reluctant gesture, he pushed the heavy volumes toward me. "You can put these back yourself. I won't ask you to disturb yourself again tonight." It was the first time he had acknowledged my effort without qualification. It was the first time he had given me permission to leave him without feeling I was abandoning a post. From that point, the dynamic settled into something entirely unexpected, a bizarre, high-stakes partnership forged in silence and necessity. I stopped trying to be Seraphina. I embraced my role as the capable shadow. I learned the layout of the office wing, the blind spots in the security camera system, which I reported to Thorn privately, maintaining my guise as a decorative wife, and the precise timing of Rylan's afternoon headaches, which always required absolute quiet and a specific blend of herbal tea I sourced from a specialist supplier across town. I never asked about his sight. It was the unspoken treaty between us. I would serve the needs of the position, and he would not probe the origins of my compliance, nor the lack thereof in my emotional demeanor. The resentment I initially felt began to transmute into a strange form of professional respect. Rylan Vance was undeniably brilliant. His mind moved with terrifying speed, capable of holding thousands of variables in motion simultaneously. He was merciless, yes, but he was fair in the way a force of nature is fair, unfeeling, but adhering to predictable laws. My life became a series of small, successful interventions. I caught an internal memo suggesting a data leak. I rearranged his schedule based on the energy levels I observed in his physical presence. I became the indispensable operational layer that kept the blind titan functioning in a world built for sight. He began to rely on me, quietly, without fanfare. He didn't praise me, he simply factored my presence into his calculations. "Elara, I need to review the acquisition targets for Omnicorp. Have Thorn print the hard copies, and then have Elara review the summary aloud while I listen to the audio feed." He wouldn't look at me, but he would wait for my confirming breath. My heart still pounded, but now it was the thrill of performance, not terror. I was mastering the role, molding the constraints of my cage into a framework for action. One winter evening, about 2 years into the marriage, the city outside was enveloped in a thick, suffocating fog, the kind that made the headlights of distant cars bloom into hazy, useless circles. Rylan had been working late, wrestling with a hostile takeover attempt that was threatening to unravel years of meticulous planning. I brought him his late-night coffee, setting it down precisely where his hand would find the ceramic instantly. "The vultures are circling, Elara," he murmured, not looking up from the tactile data pad Thorn had prepared for him. "Croft is making his final move at dawn. If this falls apart, we lose everything we built here." "You won't lose it, Mr. Vance," I said, leaning against the door frame. "You haven't come this far to lose to a man who relies on theatrics." "Theatrics work when the audience is blind," he countered grimly. "Then give the audience something else to focus on," I suggested, speaking instinctively, drawing on the vague knowledge I'd gleaned from countless overheard conversations about corporate defense mechanisms. "Croft is predictable. He wants a public victory. Don't fight him on his terms, make his victory irrelevant before the market opens." He stopped moving. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. "How?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Give him what he thinks he wants, but dilute it. A strategic, controlled surrender on a non-essential subsidiary, one whose value is largely perceived rather than tangible. Announce it late tonight, with maximum impact. He'll claim victory, use his momentum to finalize the lesser deal, And by the time he realizes the core assets are untouchable, it will be too late for him to pivot. Rylan sat back, and I could almost visualize the intricate gears turning behind his unseeing eyes. That requires trusting a projection based on anecdotal evidence from a non-specialist, he analyzed. It requires trusting the patterns you've taught me to see, sir, I countered softly. Croft thrives on narrative. Feed him a compelling ending to this chapter, and he'll neglect the sequel. A long moment passed. Then, he turned to his intercom. Thorn. Wake up the legal team. Draft a provisional release statement regarding the divestiture of the Aegean Holdings subsidiary. Notify the major newswires that Vance Corp will be making a significant announcement regarding restructuring at 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Elara will be supplying the essential context. My stomach dropped. He was giving me the reins, not just for administrative tasks, but for strategy. For the next 4 hours, I sat beside him, my voice taking on an unfamiliar authority as I relayed the exact wording of the planned concession, while Rylan guided the legal team through the necessary loopholes to ensure the surrender was indeed illusory. I was no longer Elara, the shadow twin, I was the operational voice of Rylan Vance. When the final confirmation signal came through the system, signaling the news wires had picked up the story, Rylan leaned back, a deep, shuddering breath escaping him. It is done, he said. I looked at the dark expanse where his eyes should have been focused. It is done, Mr. Vance. He sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion. Go to bed, Elara. You have earned it. I retreated, but as I reached my door, he called out one last time. Elara. Yes, sir. You are remarkably effective. It was the closest thing to a compliment I had ever received. I simply nodded, unable to speak, and closed the door softly behind me. The fog lifted the next morning, revealing a city shining under a cold, clear sun. Silas Croft had indeed claimed a massive victory in the early hours, basking in the glow of what he believed was Vance Corp's spectacular retreat. By noon, however, the financial analysts realized the truth. Aegean Holdings was a gilded cage, and Rylan Vance had cheerfully handed Croft the key to an empty room while securing the fortress. Croft's stock plummeted as his initial euphoria curdled into frantic damage control. Rylan Vance had won. That afternoon, there was no board meeting, no demanding dictation. Rylan summoned me to the sunroom, a place of pale light and imported greenery that he usually avoided because of the glare. I entered cautiously. He was standing by a large potted orchid, his hand tracing the delicate curve of a petal. Thorn was nowhere in sight. The restructuring held, Rylan stated, his voice calm, almost conversational. Croft is currently in emergency mediation. He won't trouble us again. Good, I replied, standing respectfully several feet away. He turned his head toward me, and for a fleeting second, I felt a peculiar sensation, as if his focus was not just aimed at my voice, but somehow through the space where my eyes should have been. Elara, he began, his tone shifting, losing the professional edge that had been my constant companion for 2 years. You have been married to me for 26 months. During that time, you have navigated my world flawlessly, despite lacking any inherent understanding of it. I waited, braced for the next instruction or criticism. You are not Seraphina, he continued. You are not the daughter my family hoped for, nor the trophy my business partners expected. You are something else entirely. He stepped away from the orchid, moving slowly toward me. I instinctively stood straighter, waiting for the inevitable demand for a separation agreement, the payment to ensure my continued silence. I have always understood that my condition, my blindness, made me reliant on proxies. I assumed, based on Thorn's briefing and my initial, brief contact with you, that you were selected for your docility. A quiet presence to keep the legal status intact. He paused, his hand lifting slightly, as if reaching for something he couldn't quite grasp. I was deeply wrong. My breath hitched. This was unprecedented territory. You have managed this house, my reputation, and my most critical operational vulnerabilities with a precision that surpasses any salaried executive I employ. You did this without expectation of reward, and with an unnerving degree of personal sacrifice. He took another step. Now he was alarmingly close. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his expensive cologne. "Why?" he finally asked, and the single word was imbued with a genuine, raw need for understanding that cut through years of guarded silence. "Why the total commitment to a life you clearly despise? Why endure the silence and the assumption of incompetence?" I looked at the floor, feeling the weight of 2 years of hidden effort pressing down on me. This was the moment of truth. If I lied now, I would be trapped forever in the pretense. "I didn't despise the life, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I despised the assumption that I was incapable of living it meaningfully. I am not used to being seen, sir. When you require competence, when you demand action, your blindness forces you to rely on merit, not superficial appearance. In a world built for my sister, I was invisible. Here, in the dark, I could finally contribute. It wasn't about marrying you for comfort, it was about surviving by being essential." He stood still, absorbing this confession, this declaration of quiet ambition. Then, the moment that splintered reality. Rylan Vance reached out, his hands finding my shoulders, not to correct my posture, but holding me firmly. "Elara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, husky register that sent a tremor through my entire frame. "I made an assumption that has haunted every interaction I've had since the accident. I assumed the world was defined by what I could no longer see. I assumed that without vision, partnership meant pity, or manipulation." He squeezed my shoulders gently. "I judged you based on the faint echo of your sister's voice on our wedding day, a voice I remember vividly, because Seraphina was the one who arranged the original merger talks. You sounded different, hesitant, small." My mind raced. Seraphina. She hadn't backed out because of the blindness, she backed out because the merger required continuous, personal commitment. And she had clearly coached me, or at least allowed Rylan to believe I was less articulate than I was. "Seraphina," I began, the realization dawning with sickening clarity. Seraphina was frightened of the commitment required when the visual component of our relationship was stripped away, Rylan confirmed, his tone devoid of judgment toward her, only focused on the facts. "She never intended to remain here. But you stayed. You built competence where I expected dependency." He released my shoulders and then, with agonizing slowness, his hands moved up my arms, tracing the line of my collarbone, lingering at the nape of my neck. It was the first deliberate, non-functional touch he had ever offered. It was exploratory, a learning process. "I know your patterns now, Elara," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "I know the sound of your focused silence. I know the rhythm of your steps when you are determined. I know the cadence of your voice when you are defending a principle. And I have come to realize that I have spent the last 2 years in a self-imposed darkness, not just from the accident, but from ignoring the very person standing next to me." He moved his hands to cup my face, his thumbs resting gently beneath my eyes. His touch was tentative, almost reverent. "I have lived in a world of black and white for too long, Elara. A world where sight determined truth. I have been cruel because I believed that fragility required harshness to survive. I have insulted the only person who ever bothered to truly see the structure of my challenges, rather than my limitations. I could only breathe, feeling the strange, terrifying hope rising within me. "I need to apologize," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I need to tell you that your presence is no longer a contract. It is necessary. You are essential." He leaned closer, and the proximity was overwhelming. I felt the reality of the moment crystallize. 2 years of enduring the coldness of a marriage built on a lie had somehow forged something genuine in the shadows. I never wanted a stand-in, Rylan admitted, his forehead gently brushing mine. I wanted a partner who could see the architecture of my ambition, even when I couldn't see the sunlight myself. Then, in a gesture so startling, so utterly contradictory to the man I thought I knew, he did the unthinkable. He looked directly at me, or rather, he aimed his sightless gaze at the precise point where my eyes met his invisible ones, and then he slowly, deliberately, sank to his knees on the polished marble floor of the sunroom. The sound of his expensive suit trousers brushing the cold stone was the loudest sound in the vast house. I gasped, stepping back instinctively, terrified he was having a medical episode. "Mr. Vance? What are you doing? Get up!" He ignored my panicked plea, his hand still loosely holding my waist. He knelt there, utterly vulnerable, the Titan brought low by his own realization. "Elara," he repeated, the title now stripped of all formal pretense, resonant with a deep and emotion. He looked up at me, a man completely exposed in his ruin and his reverence. "You were never meant to be the substitute," he said, his voice thick with regret, the confession tearing from him like a physical thing. "You were always meant to be the anchor." And then, the words that shattered the last vestiges of my long-held isolation, the words that finally validated every silent moment of service, every swallowed insult, every lonely night spent mastering the dark hallways of his life. "My wife. My dearest, brilliant wife. Forgive me. I see you now."